Northern Ontario. Winter, 1908. 3 gold prospectors ventured into territory the Ojibwe refused to enter. They called it Wendigo country. Within days, the men heard voices in the darkness, voices of their dead loved ones, calling them by name. Footprints circled their camp. Something was watching. Something was waiting. Something was whispering calculations of survival that ended in murder. This is their story. If you want to hear more true tales of historical horror and cryptid encounters, subscribe now. John McLeod told me the forest had a voice before we ever heard it ourselves. I thought he meant wind through the pines or the crack of ice on the lakes. The usual sounds a man learns when he spends winter in the bush. I was wrong. McLeod meant something that knew your name, that could shape your mother's voice or your brother's laugh, that could make you walk toward it even when every instinct screamed to run. I learned the difference between wind and that other thing on the 4th night, when I heard my dead father calling from beyond our firelight, using words only he and I had ever known. My name is William Hargreaves, and in January of 1908, I came north to Ontario with a geological survey contract and dreams of gold. The Canadian Pacific had pushed rails through Sudbury, and prospectors were flooding the territories around Lake Temiskaming, finding silver by the ton. Gold was rumored farther north, in countries so remote, the Ojibwe trappers would only pass through it in summer. I'd worked coal mines in Pennsylvania and copper claims in Montana, but I'd never felt cold like the Ontario winter. It wasn't just temperature. It was a cold that lived in your bones, that made your teeth ache and your thoughts slow like frozen syrup. McLeod ran our 3-man operation. He was 42, Scottish by birth, with 20 years in the Northern Territories and a face that looked like weathered granite. He'd prospected from the Yukon to James Bay, survived scurvy and frostbite, once walked 90 miles through a blizzard after his dogs died. He knew the bush the way a sailor knows the sea, with respect that bordered on fear. When McLeod spoke about the forest, he used words like temperament and mood, as if the wilderness were a living creature that could take offense. Our 3rd man was Patrick O'Neill, the camp cook. 30 years old, Irish, built like a barrel with hands that could bend iron pots, but produced the finest sourdough biscuits I'd ever tasted. O'Neill had cooked for lumber camps across Quebec and Ontario, following the timber frontier north. He kept our supplies organized, our stove running, our water barrels from freezing solid. In a winter camp, a good cook was worth 3 laborers. O'Neill sang while he worked. Old ballads from County Cork, French-Canadian logging songs, bawdy tunes that made McLeod shake his head and grin. We'd established camp in late November, building our cabin on the south shore of a nameless lake about 80 miles north of Temagami. The nearest settlement was a Hudson's Bay trading post 3 days' travel south, and even that was just 4 buildings and a dock. Our cabin was spruce logs chinked with moss and mud, a single room with bunks along one wall, the stove in the center, and our supplies stacked against the other walls. The roof was split cedar shingles weighted with stones. Wind came through gaps we couldn't find, no matter how much moss we stuffed into the cracks. The forest around us was primeval, white pine and black spruce so thick you couldn't see 50 yards in any direction. The trees stood like cathedral pillars, their bark blackened by centuries of cold. Snow lay 4 feet deep in the hollows, the surface crusted hard enough to bear a man's weight some mornings, treacherous and soft in others. We cut test pits across the frozen lake and into the hillsides, following quartz outcroppings, looking for the telltale green staining that meant copper. the glint of gold in crushed rock. The work was brutal. We'd rise before dawn, eat O'Neill's porridge and salt pork, then spend 8 hours swinging picks and hauling rock samples. My hands bled inside my gloves. My shoulders burned. At night, we'd thaw by the stove, eating beans and bannock, while McLeod read aloud from a 3-year-old newspaper, or O'Neill told stories about loggers who'd fallen into river drives. We played cards by lantern light, betting matches, and tobacco. Outside, the temperature would drop to 40 below, cold enough to hear trees exploding when their sap froze. By Christmas, we'd been in camp 6 weeks without finding anything worth filing a claim. Our supplies were calculated to last until March, but we were eating more than planned because the cold made you constantly hungry. O'Neill started rationing the flour. McLeod shortened our workdays to conserve lamp oil. I began to notice how silence could be a physical presence, how the absence of sound pressed against your ears like deep water. No birds sang in that country. No squirrels chattered. Even the wind seemed to avoid those particular trees. The whispers started on January 14th, though none of us admitted hearing them until later. I was cutting firewood behind the cabin when I heard someone say, "William," in a voice like my mother's. I turned, expecting to see nothing, and saw exactly that. Just snow and trees and the gray winter light. I told myself I'd imagined it, that isolation played tricks. But I noticed I was gripping the axe very tightly, and my breath was coming faster than the work demanded. That night, O'Neill was quiet during supper. He kept glancing at the door, which we'd barred with a pine beam. McLeod asked if he was feeling poorly. O'Neill said no, then admitted he'd heard something odd while hauling water that afternoon. A voice calling his name from across the lake. He'd looked but saw only ice and snow. McLeod nodded slowly and said he'd heard something similar that morning. A voice that sounded like his brother's, though his brother had died in the Boer War 6 years ago. We sat in silence, listening to the stove tick and crackle. Wind moaned through the trees outside. Finally, McLeod stood and pulled a thick journal from his pack. He opened it and read aloud from entries made by earlier prospectors in the region. One party in 1889 had abandoned their camp after a month, citing unnatural disturbances. Another in 1902 had lost 2 men to what they called winter fever. Though the symptoms described didn't match any illness McLeod recognized. A third group had simply disappeared, their camp found intact but empty the following spring, the stove still loaded with firewood. The Ojibwe have a name for these territories, McLeod said, closing the journal. They call them the Hollow Lands. They say something lives here that eats more than flesh, that it eats sense and warmth and hope. They say it can mimic voices, that it walks on 2 legs but isn't human, that it grows stronger as you grow weaker. O'Neill asked what McLeod thought we should do. McLeod said we should acknowledge what we were hearing, not dismiss it, that we should stay together, never wander off alone, and keep the cabin secured at night, that we should maintain our routines and our health, because whatever was out there seemed to feed on fear and isolation. He didn't say the word Wendigo, but I saw it written in his journal when he set it down. The letters seemed to pull at my eyes. The footprints appeared 2 days later. I found them circling our cabin in the pre-dawn darkness, walking in from the forest, looping around the structure 3 times, then heading back toward the trees. But they didn't lead away. They simply stopped at the tree line, as if whatever made them had vanished into the air or climbed straight up the trunks. The prints were human-shaped but wrong, too long in the foot, too wide in the stride, with toes that seemed to have split into claws. McLeod studied them in the gray morning light. He measured the stride at over 6 feet, far longer than any man could walk comfortably. The depth of the print suggested something very tall and very light, as if the bones had hollowed out. In places, the prints showed drag marks, as if the feet were being pulled along rather than lifted. McLeod took a long time before speaking. When he did, his voice was very quiet. "I've seen tracks like this once before, in the Yukon, during the winter of '96. We lost 3 men from our party. They walked out into a blizzard, one after another, over 3 nights. We found them a week later, scattered across 5 miles of tundra. They'd been opened. Everything inside was gone, but there wasn't enough blood. Whatever killed them had eaten very carefully, very deliberately." O'Neill asked if McLeod thought the same thing was here. McLeod said he didn't know, but that we needed to take precautions. We spent that day fortifying the cabin, nailing shutters across the window, reinforcing the door with extra planking, building up our firewood supply so we wouldn't need to go out after dark. McLeod strung fishing line with tin cans attached around the cabin perimeter. He said it wouldn't stop anything, but it would give us warning. That night, none of us slept deeply. I kept waking to hear O'Neill or McLeod stirring in their bunks, adding wood to the stove, checking the door. Around midnight, the tin cans rattled. We all sat up instantly. McLeod lit a lantern and crept to the door, listening. For a long moment, there was only the wind. Then we heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. They stopped at each wall, as if something were examining the structure, looking for weaknesses. A voice called from outside. It was my father's voice, perfect in every detail. The slight Irish lilt, the way he cleared his throat before speaking, the exact tone he'd used when calling me to supper as a boy. "William," it said, "I'm cold, son. Let me in. I've walked so far. I'm so terribly cold." My hand moved toward the door bar before I could stop myself. O'Neill grabbed my wrist. His grip was iron strong, and his face in the lantern light looked sick with fear. I realized I'd been standing, moving toward the door, with no memory of deciding to do so. McLeod said my name sharply, and the spell, because that's what it felt like, a spell, broke. The voice outside continued. "William, please. It's your father. Don't you recognize me? I've come all this way. Just open the door. I need to see your face. I need to come inside where it's warm." But my father had been dead for 7 years, killed when a mine shaft collapsed in Pennsylvania. I'd received the telegram, attended his funeral, stood by his grave. Whatever was outside wearing his voice was something else entirely. I sat back down on my bunk, shaking. O'Neill kept his hand on my shoulder. McLeod stood by the door with his Winchester rifle, not aiming at anything, just holding it. The voice tried other tactics. It became my mother, my sister, a woman I'd courted in Montana. Each voice was perfect. Each knew things, private things, intimate details that should have been impossible for anyone else to know. The thing outside our cabin wore our loved ones like masks, speaking with their voices, trying to find the words that would make us open the door. It tried for 2 hours. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the voices stopped. The footsteps retreated. The forest fell silent again. We sat awake until dawn, not speaking, feeding the fire, listening. When gray light finally seeped through the shutter cracks, McLeod opened the door carefully. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, covering everything. But near the door, preserved under the eaves overhang, was a single print. It was enormous. Nearly 2 feet long, narrow and stretched, with claw marks at the toe positions. And pressed into the snow beside it was a human handprint, small and delicate, like a child's. But the fingers were too long, and there were too many joints. McLeod closed the door and slid the bar back into place. He looked at O'Neill and me with eyes that seemed to have aged years overnight. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "we need to discuss our options very carefully, because I don't think that thing is finished with us, and I don't think it's going to let us simply walk away." The question was whether we could reach the trading post before the thing killed us. McLeod spread his maps across the table, while weak January sunlight filtered through the shutter gaps. 3 days' travel south in summer conditions, he said. But we were facing 4 feet of snow, sub-zero temperatures, and something that could apparently track us through the forest. We'd need to carry supplies for at least 5 days in case storms delayed us, which meant heavy packs through difficult terrain. And we'd be moving slowly, vulnerably, through country where that thing could approach from any direction. O'Neill argued for staying put. The cabin was defensible, he said. We had walls and a door and enough supplies to last until March if we rationed carefully. The thing outside couldn't get in unless we let it. McLeod pointed out that it hadn't really tried yet, that the footprints and voices felt like testing, like something intelligent was learning about us, probing for weaknesses. He said the Yukon men had been in a fortified camp too, and it hadn't saved them. I asked what McLeod thought the thing wanted. He was quiet for a long time before answering. Finally, he said that according to Ojibwe accounts, the Wendigo was born from starvation and cannibalism. That when a man ate human flesh in desperation, something entered him, something that could never be satisfied, that grew larger the more it consumed. The creature was eternally hungry, eternally cold, eternally craving. It didn't just want to kill us. It wanted us to become like it, to cross that final threshold where hunger made you forget you were human. The voices aren't just mimicry, McLeod said. They're temptation. It's trying to isolate us from each other, to make us suspicious and desperate. Once we stop trusting each other, once we start seeing each other as potential threats instead of companions, we're already half turned. That's when it wins. Not when it kills us, but when it makes us capable of killing each other. We decided to wait 1 more week. If the disturbances continued or escalated, we'd attempt the journey south. If they stopped, we'd reassess. It seemed reasonable at the time, a measured response to an impossible situation. Looking back, I realized we were already thinking like trapped animals, trying to find the least dangerous corner of a cage that had no safe spaces. That day, we established new protocols. No one went outside alone, ever. We'd work in pairs, with the 3rd man watching from the cabin door with the rifle. We'd mark our route to the test pits with flagged stakes so we couldn't get turned around in the forest. We'd carry whistles and agreed on specific signals. 2 short blasts meant return to cabin immediately. 3 meant danger. McLeod divided the night into 3 watches, rotating every 2 hours so we'd all get some sleep but never leave the cabin unguarded. The system worked for 2 days. We fell back into routines, working our claims, eating meals, playing cards. The forest remained silent. No voices called, no footprints appeared. O'Neill started joking again, singing Irish ballads while cooking. I began to think maybe the thing had moved on, found other prey, lost interest. McLeod didn't share my optimism. He watched the tree line constantly, rifle always within reach, and I noticed he'd stopped eating much, just picked at his food, then wrapped the remainder in cloth and stored it in his pack. On the 3rd day, we found the deer. It was a large buck, maybe 200 pounds, hung upside down from a tree branch about 50 yards from our cabin. Its belly had been opened very precisely, everything inside removed, the cavity scraped completely clean. But there was no blood on the snow beneath it. No signs of butchering, no tracks leading to or from the tree. The deer's head was intact, and its eyes were still open, reflecting the gray sky. O'Neill approached it first. He reached out to touch the carcass, then jerked his hand back. "It's frozen solid," he said. "But look at the organs. They're not here. They're not anywhere nearby. Whatever did this didn't eat on sight. It carried everything away. Why would it do that?" McLeod studied the tree branch. It was 12 feet off the ground, too high for a man to reach without climbing. But there were no marks on the trunk, no sign anything had climbed. The deer appeared to have been lifted straight up and placed there as carefully as a butcher would hang meat in a smokehouse. McLeod said we needed to go back to the cabin immediately. His voice had an edge I hadn't heard before, not quite fear, but something close to it. That night, the voices returned, but they were different. Instead of our loved ones, we heard ourselves. My own voice called from outside, saying things I'd said earlier that day, comments about the cold, observations about the test pit samples, a joke I'd made about O'Neill's cooking. It was my voice exactly, replayed like a phonograph recording, except the thing outside was arranging the words in new orders, creating sentences I'd never spoken. "William doesn't trust you anymore," my voice said to the others. "William thinks you're planning to leave him behind. William knows you've been taking extra rations." O'Neill's voice answered, "Patrick wants to go south now. Patrick thinks McLeod is losing his mind. Patrick remembers what happened to the Yukon men." McLeod's voice joined in. "John knows what you're thinking. John can smell your fear. John remembers what human meat tastes like." We sat in the cabin, listening to ourselves having conversations we'd never had, speaking suspicions we'd never voiced. The thing was using our own voices to poison us against each other. I found myself glancing at McLeod and O'Neill differently, wondering if there was truth in the twisted words outside. I could see them doing the same, their eyes moving between us, calculating, measuring, doubting. McLeod stood abruptly and fired 3 shots through the roof. Boom, boom, boom. The rifle reports deafening in the small cabin. The voices outside stopped instantly. In the ringing silence that followed, McLeod reloaded calmly, then looked at us. "It's trying to break us apart," he said. "Don't let it. Whatever you hear out there, whatever it says in our voices, remember it's not us. We're right here. We're together, that's all that matters." But something had already broken. I could feel it in the way O'Neill wouldn't quite meet my eyes, in the way I kept checking where McLeod's rifle was, in the heaviness of the silence between us. The thing outside had planted seeds of mistrust, and they were growing in the dark, fertile soil of our fear and isolation. We tried to play cards, but kept making mistakes, losing track of the game. O'Neill burned the evening meal, something he'd never done before. McLeod cleaned his rifle 3 times, unnecessarily, his hands moving through the familiar motions while his mind was clearly elsewhere. Around midnight during my watch, I heard scratching on the roof. Slow, deliberate, like something was writing messages in the frost that coated the shingles. The sound moved from one end of the cabin to the other, then back again. I woke McLeod quietly. He listened, then climbed onto the table and pressed his ear against the ceiling. His face went very still. He climbed down and whispered that whatever was up there was heavy. He could hear the roof beams creaking under its weight. Should we go out? I whispered back. Drive it off? McLeod shook his head. That's what it wants. It wants us outside, separated from shelter, panicked and vulnerable. We stay here. We wait. The scratching continued for an hour, then stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard something worse. A voice that sounded like my own, but somehow fundamentally wrong. Like hearing yourself on a wax recording, but knowing the recording had been altered. I'm so hungry, it said from the roof. We're all so hungry. Why are we waiting? Why don't we just take what we need? The next morning, we climbed onto the roof to see what had been scratched there. The frost had been scraped away in patterns, shapes that might have been letters or might have been something else entirely. They looked almost like the symbols I'd seen in McLeod's journal, the Ojibwe warnings about Wendigo territory. But these were bigger, cruder, scratched by something that had fingers but didn't quite remember how to write. O'Neill's behavior changed after that. He became obsessive about the food supplies, counting and recounting them, rearranging the stores, writing inventory lists in the margins of newspapers. He stopped eating meals with us, claiming he wasn't hungry, that he'd eat later. But I never saw him eat. He grew thinner, his face becoming gaunt, his eyes developing a feverish intensity. When McLeod asked if he was ill, O'Neill laughed, a high, brittle sound that didn't match his usual humor. I'm seeing clearly for the first time, O'Neill said. We have 17 pounds of flour left, 3 pounds of salt pork, maybe 8 pounds of dried beans. That's not enough for 3 men to reach March. The mathematics don't work, don't you see? The numbers don't balance. McLeod said we'd leave for the trading post within 2 days, that we'd carry enough supplies for the journey and abandon the rest. O'Neill shook his head violently. No, you're not hearing me? Even for the journey, 5 days, 3 men, that's 15 man-days of food. We don't have 15 days. We have maybe 10 if we ration severely. Someone has to stay behind. Someone has to reduce the consumption equation. I realized with horror that O'Neill was talking about sacrifice, about one of us staying behind to die so the others would have enough food to make it south. The logic was coldly mathematical, brutally rational, and completely insane. McLeod must have seen it in my face because he moved between us and O'Neill, his hand near his rifle. Patrick, McLeod said carefully, that thing outside has been whispering to you, hasn't it? In the night, when you're supposed to be sleeping. It's been doing mathematics with you, showing you numbers that add up to murder. But the numbers are lies. We have enough food. We'll make it together. O'Neill's laugh had no humor in it. You think I'm possessed? You think I've gone winter mad? I'm the only one thinking clearly. I'm the only one who's looked at our situation honestly. The thing outside isn't the real danger. The real danger is that we're all going to starve, slowly, pointlessly, when one simple decision could save 2 lives. He moved toward the supplies, and McLeod stepped directly into his path. For a long moment, they stood facing each other. O'Neill's fever-bright eyes locked on McLeod's weathered face. I couldn't tell who would break first, who would escalate the confrontation into violence. Then O'Neill deflated, his shoulders sagging, tears starting down his cheeks. I can hear it, he whispered. Even now, I can hear it in my head, counting, calculating, showing me solutions. It sounds like my own thoughts. But they're not. They can't be because I'd never think these things. But what if they are mine? What if this is who I become when I'm hungry enough? What if the monster isn't outside at all? McLeod guided O'Neill to a bunk and made him lie down. He found rope in our supplies and very gently, very carefully, tied O'Neill's hands and feet. Not tightly enough to hurt, but securely enough to prevent sudden movements. O'Neill didn't resist. He closed his eyes and turned his face to the wall. "Thank you," he whispered. "Don't let me loose, no matter what I say. Promise me." We left at dawn on January 23rd, 9 days after the voices first began. O'Neill had recovered somewhat. The fever in his eyes had dimmed, and he could speak rationally again, though he remained frighteningly thin. McLeod had kept him tied for 2 days, feeding him small portions, talking to him constantly, keeping him anchored to reality. Whatever had been whispering in O'Neill's mind seemed to have retreated. But we all knew it was temporary. The thing outside had found a way into one of us. It would try again. We packed methodically. 3 packs with equal weight: food, blankets, tools, ammunition. We'd travel together, never more than arm's length apart, moving south by compass bearing since the trails were buried under snow. McLeod estimated 12 to 15 miles per day if conditions held, which meant 4 days minimum to the trading post. We left the cabin door open behind us, a gesture of finality. Whatever happened, we wouldn't be coming back. The forest was waiting. That's the only way I can describe it. The trees seemed to lean inward as we passed. The silence felt intentional, and the cold had a quality of attention, as if the temperature itself were watching us. We moved in single file, McLeod leading with compass and rifle, me in the middle, O'Neill at the rear. Our snowshoes crunched rhythmically, our breath plumed in the still air. Nothing else moved. By midday, we'd covered maybe 4 miles. The snow was deeper than McLeod had anticipated, and the terrain was broken by ravines and frozen streams that forced detours. We stopped to rest on a fallen log, eating bannock and dried meat, not speaking much. O'Neill kept glancing behind us, his hand gripping his walking stick with white-knuckled intensity. When I asked what he saw, he said nothing, but his eyes told a different story. We found the first marker around 2 in the afternoon, a cairn of rocks that shouldn't have existed, stacked in the middle of a frozen creek bed. McLeod examined it carefully, then knocked it over with his boot. "It's marking us," he said. "Tracking our progress. It knows exactly where we are." An hour later, we found another cairn, this one built from ice chunks arranged in a spiral pattern. Then another, made from stripped pine branches woven together like a basket. The markers appeared every half mile, each one different, each one clearly intentional. They weren't random. They were messages, though we couldn't read them. Or perhaps they were claims, the thing outside staking ownership of the territory we were crossing. As the light began to fail, we made camp in a dense stand of spruce trees. McLeod chose a spot where the branches overhead were thick enough to prevent anything from easily approaching from above. We cleared snow down to the frozen ground, built a fire, arranged our packs in a triangle so we'd be back to back. The temperature was dropping rapidly, probably 30 below, cold enough to kill an unprotected man in minutes. O'Neill cooked a thin stew from our supplies, while McLeod and I gathered deadfall for the fire. We didn't range far, maybe 20 feet from camp, but even that small distance felt dangerous. The forest seemed to swallow sound. I'd call out to McLeod and hear my voice die after a few yards, absorbed by the snow and trees. He'd answer, but his voice sounded muffled, distant, even though I could see him clearly just a few paces away. That night, we heard it moving parallel to our camp, not trying to hide, not stalking silently, but deliberately making noise. Branches snapping, snow crunching, the sound of something very large walking in slow circles around our fire. McLeod kept the fire built high, the flames roaring 6 feet tall, consuming our carefully gathered wood at an alarming rate. But it was worth it. The light and heat seemed to keep the thing at bay. Around midnight, O'Neill began to sing. Not his usual Irish ballads, but something else. A melody I didn't recognize, with words in a language that sounded native but wrong, the syllables harsh and clicking. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring into the fire, and his voice had changed, become higher and thinner. McLeod shook him hard, and O'Neill blinked, confused, asking why we'd woken him when he hadn't been asleep. "You were singing," I said. "Something in another language." O'Neill's face went pale. "I don't remember. What was I singing?" None of us could reproduce the words, though the melody lingered unpleasantly in memory. McLeod said we needed to keep O'Neill awake, that whatever was out there was trying to use him again, speaking through him, maybe calling to others of its kind. We took turns talking to O'Neill, asking him questions about his childhood in Ireland, his time in the lumber camps, anything to keep him engaged and present. His answers became increasingly confused as the night wore on, mixing memories from different years, attributing events to wrong people, losing track of basic facts about his own life. Dawn came slowly, the darkness reluctant to lift. When there was finally enough light to travel, we found that our fire had burned down to coals, and arranged in those coals were shapes. Stick figures, crude but deliberate, made from unburned branches. They depicted 3 men walking in a line, and walking behind them, much larger, was a 4th figure with antlers. We kicked the fire apart and moved south, pushing harder than the previous day, driven by fear and desperation. The temperature had dropped further. My beard was solid ice. My fingers were numb inside my gloves. O'Neill stumbled frequently, and McLeod and I had to support him, one on each side, dragging him forward when his legs wouldn't work properly. He mumbled constantly, fragments of prayers, bits of songs, streams of numbers that might have been inventory counts or might have been something else. We reached the trading post on the afternoon of January the 26th, 4 days after leaving our cabin. The factor, a French-Canadian named Dubois, took one look at us and called for help. We collapsed in his store, too exhausted to speak coherently. Dubois gave us hot tea laced with whiskey and wrapped us in blankets while his Ojibwe wife prepared food. Other men from the post gathered around, asking what had happened, why we looked like we'd been to hell and back. McLeod told them. He spoke carefully, precisely, leaving out nothing. The voices, the footprints, the thing on our roof, O'Neill's breakdown, the markers that followed us through the forest. The men listened in silence. When McLeod finished, Dubois nodded slowly and said we were lucky to have made it out. He said 2 other prospecting parties had vanished in that territory over the past 3 years, their camps found empty or not found at all. The Ojibwe won't go there, Dubois said. They call it Wendigo country. They say a trapper killed and ate his partner there during a hard winter in the 1870s, and the land has been poisoned ever since. The man-eater didn't die. He became something else, something that still walks those woods, still hunting, still hungry. You felt it trying to enter you, yes? Whispering mathematics, showing you justifications. That's how it works. It doesn't just kill, it corrupts. It makes you capable of the unthinkable, then feeds on what you become. O'Neill began weeping quietly. McLeod put a hand on his shoulder. I stared at my hands, watching them shake, thinking about how close we'd come to crossing that final line. Another few days in the cabin, another few nights of whispers, and one of us would have broken completely. The thing would have won, not by killing us, but by making us kill each other. We stayed at the trading post for 2 weeks, recovering our strength. O'Neill gained back some weight and his mind cleared, though he never sang again. McLeod wrote a detailed report and submitted it to the provincial authorities, recommending the territory be marked as dangerous and closed to prospecting. The report was filed and forgotten. Men kept going north, kept chasing gold and silver, kept disappearing into country that didn't want them. I returned to Pennsylvania in March, took a job in a coal mine where the dangers were honest and comprehensible. Cave-ins, gas pockets, flooding. I married, had children, built a life that felt safe and ordinary. But I never forgot the sound of my father's voice calling from outside the cabin, or the feeling of my hand moving toward the door bar without my conscious will, or the terrible logic that had consumed O'Neill's mind. McLeod went back north the following year. Not to the same territory, he wasn't that foolish, but to other claims, other winters. I received a letter from him in 1914, written from a camp somewhere in the Yukon. He said he could feel it out there sometimes, in the darkest part of winter, in the oldest forests. That hunger that was more than hunger, that cold that came from something broken in the world. He said knowing it was there, knowing what lived in the spaces between settlements, made him appreciate civilization in ways he never had before. The letter ended with a warning. Some country doesn't want us, William. Some places belong to older things, and we should have the wisdom to leave them alone. I never heard from him again. O'Neill moved to Toronto, opened a restaurant, lived quietly until his death in 1936. I'm told he kept the lights burning all night, every night, and wouldn't allow his establishment to be closed even for a single evening. He understood what the darkness could hold. I'm 73 now, writing this in 1953 because someone should know what happened in northern Ontario in the winter of 1908. The maps still show that territory as empty crown land, available for prospecting and development. But Dubois was right. It's Wendigo country, and some hungers never sleep. They just wait, patient as stones, for the next desperate men to wander into their domain. If you go north, if you chase gold or timber or whatever else that country pretends to offer, remember this. When you hear voices calling your name in the forest, when you find tracks that circle your camp instead of passing through, when the cold seems to have intention and your hunger begins to whisper mathematics, leave. Don't wait for proof. Don't try to understand. Don't convince yourself it's imagination or isolation or winter madness. Just leave, while you still remember why you should.